Okay, well, I'm very happy to be with you all. I can't see you, but I know you're there, or at least Val tells me you're there. I'm Jack Putz. I'm a professor at the University of Florida. I came here in 1982 from the tropics and via upstate New York. Started teaching a course called Ecosystems of Florida pretty soon after I got here. Man, was I making a lot of grave errors. And errors is the topic or the theme of my presentation today. Because in about 1985, I started getting interested in landscape restoration. And for me, restoration is a form of gardening. And I think this is the form of gardening that involves native species, but trying to recreate native habitat, trying to use processes that happen in nature or surrogate processes that mimic the effects of for example, fire. Um, and and I'm doing restoration at a pretty large scale, at least for an individual, because I'm lucky to live on a land trust in outside of Gainesville, where the other members of the land trust are also interested in restoration. So I'm going to talk today about restoration of longleaf pine savanna, but we're also trying to restore hammock or broadleaf forest. And if I have time, I'll tell you about an ill-fated attempt to restore an ecosystem that's almost gone, called a cane brake with native bamboo. Fascinating, but difficult. But let me get on to this idea of landscape gardening or landscape restoration, and talk about some of the mistakes that I've made, with the hopes that some people will avoid these mistakes. I mean, my hope is to make new mistakes, not to make these same ones. And maybe just by hearing about them, then you'll avoid them. And some of the mistakes are due to ignorance. A lot of them are due just I didn't know any better, and have learned since. Some are due, I have to admit, to sloth, and some are, there's a little bit of arrogance every once in a while that creeps into my restoration efforts. But first of all, let me justify this. I don't have to justify this to you. This is the Florida Native Plant Society, and that's what we're about, is native species. I'm like these species in all kinds of situations, but in particular in natural ecosystems, so that I may be a gardener to start with, but afterwards these species continue to proliferate on their own. And this aesthetic of pine savanna is a learned aesthetic for some of us. I mean, I came here with a forest background, and most of my research and a lot of my time is spent in forest, in the tropics. But I've come to love these open canopied savannas or savanna woodlands or woodlands, with what's often described as a grassy understory, but there are a lot of forbs, broadleaf flowering species as well. And the diversity is fantastic, and flowering goes on all year long. I was just wandering this morning in an area where I'm restoring pine savanna near my home, and it's bright yellow with solidago, with goldenrods, and I mean, just so many, and the butterflies are fantastic. But coming along are the blazing stars and the carphophorus and other things. So this parade of color that happens. But unfortunately, pine savanna and other ecosystems on the coastal plain of North America are in grave jeopardy. In the map there, that's from a paper by Reed Noss, in which he and his collaborators declared this southeast coastal plain as the world's newest 37th biodiversity hotspot. And you become an area becomes a biodiversity hotspot if it has more than, I think it's a 2,000 species, that's the of plants, and has lost more than 70% of its original range. Well, for the longleaf pine savanna that occupied most of the uplands and some of the seasonally flooded flatwoods in this region, we've lost 97%. And I'd like to say that we've bottomed out, but we're still losing pine savanna. And it takes but a few minutes with heavy equipment to destroy a pine savanna. But without help, it takes a millennium or more to get it back. And that's if there's fires continue. And these are fire maintained ecosystems. The whole southeast coastal plain is a lightning hotspot. A lot of it is sandy soil, severely drained, nutrient poor, prone to frequent low intensity fires. And those fires are necessary to maintain these ecosystems. And a lot of the pine savanna was lost to clearing for development, for citrus groves, for golf courses and so forth. But also a lot of it was lost just due to fire suppression and people's misunderstanding of the role of fire in maintaining this diversity. But these numbers for diversity are flabbergasting. They're so high. More than 5,000 native plant species in this region, and 1,500, more than 1,500 of them are endemic. They're only found here. So the opportunities for gardening with that many species is just fantastic. And in contrast to the Midwestern prairies, which are also in bad shape, they're down around 2% left. Little is known about a lot of these plant species. So the fact that I'm failing to get some of these species established, despite my best efforts, is perhaps no surprise, since they're little known by science and little known by gardeners. And so for me, doing restoration is also part of my job, because my job, I'm a scientist and I'm supposed to be making discoveries. And the 2 hours I spent out in the savanna, the restored savanna this morning, I can't say that I made any discoveries, but I'm thinking about what I'm seeing all the time. So it's fun that way, in being in a place where so little is known about the native species. And also knowing that this ecosystem and these species are in such jeopardy due to, what do we have, 1,000 people a day moving into Florida, and they bring with them aesthetics and land use practices from other parts of the world. Unfortunately, some of them like lawns, and will plow up a savanna to plant them, a savanna with hundreds of species to plant exotic turf grass. And that is still happening. But so justification for restoration seems abundantly clear, at least to me. And I've described this odyssey, this learning process in this book that is available from Amazon and Kindle. It's a series of essays, of 52 of these, about local species and phenomena, not only plants, but also fox squirrels and gopher tortoises. So it's the compliment that I've most often gotten about this book is that the essays are short and you can read one and then fall asleep. Well, I'll take it as a compliment. Many of them were published in the Palmetto, and due to the expert handling and editing by Marjorie Shropshire, they're a lot nicer reads than they would be, and prettier in pictures, Shirley Denton's pictures and other people's. But this is a collection of 52 of them. And I do have to credit my field assistant, there with me, she's consistently of no help whatsoever, but she's dependable in that regard. And I should say that my wife, Claudia Romero, also an ecologist, is very supportive, because she sees this as a good way of keeping me out of the house and making sure I get plenty of exercise without having to pay the fees for a gym membership. And I don't like gyms very much anyway, but so she keeps me to a couple $100 a year of expenses on buying seed or plugs or I must admit some herbicide, but there is plenty of exercise to be had out there. Well, when I first came to Florida, again from elsewhere in the world, I saw the land that we bought, and then I bought this land trust with a couple of other people, and I looked at it, and it was scraggly pines that were loblolly pines, old field pines, bare sand, patches of dog fennel, some prodigious patches of opuntia cactus, prickly pear cactus, and not much else. I mean, it really was hurting. It had been plowed and planted with watermelons and who knows what else, probably cotton and corn and the regular. It had been rooted up by hogs. It had been heavily grazed. It had been planted with bahia grass and centipede. It had been fertilized, but seldom, and generally badly abused. And I, with this northern mindset, this forest mindset, I looked at this landscape and thought, this landscape is short of nutrients. And so what it needs is to have its fertility restored. And that was my first mistake. And we'd only had the land for a couple of weeks, and I got a call from the Gainesville Regional Utilities from the water treatment people, and they asked me if I wanted some lime. And I thought, yeah, this looks like a site that's suffering from acidity. There's all these pine trees and scraggly oaks and stuff, and it's probably super low pH, and some lime would probably help. Again, this is logic from elsewhere. And I said, well, how much is it? And they said, no, it's free. And I said, well, oh, okay. Well, what are the delivery charges? And they said, no, we'll deliver. So I was sitting in my office at the University of Florida and did some quick calculations. And I figured that for the area that I wanted to get back in ecological shape, I probably needed 10 cubic yards of lime. But I asked for 5. And that day, I came home with my pH kit. They had already delivered it, and it was slag lime, and it was in these 5 piles. Slag lime is hygroscopic. It's a sticky clay. I don't know how I would have ever spread it if I wanted to, but I measured the pH of the soil, and it was 6.3, 6.4. I didn't want to spread any lime at all. It wasn't suffering from low pH. The pH was very high. So I ended up burying that lime, taking a shovel and just burying it. But I did discover something about pawpaw roots in the process. And I got plenty of exercise. So, okay, I'll take it. But at the same time, still not understanding that pine savanna typically develops on nutrient poor sites. And that's part of why it's savanna. It's severely drained and nutrient poor, so everything has to be adapted to those conditions. If you bring in a lot of nutrients, then competitors take over from the savanna species. Well, this one I'm still paying for. I paid for this morning when I pulled up 50 hairy indigo plants. Now, I'm not sure that these hairy indigo are the 25th generation of the hairy indigo seed that I planted. I planted hairy indigo because I thought the site needed nitrogen. And hairy indigo is an exotic species. It has these nitrogen fixing nodules, and it works pretty well if you want higher nitrogen in the soil, but oh my goodness, it has seed dormancy. And so every time you disturb the soil, they come up. And my goal this year is, at least for a couple acres that I'm paying close attention to, is to not let any of them set seed. But there'll still be seeds there in the soil. So this was a real mistake of ignorance, that not understanding that some natural ecosystems do not benefit from more nutrients. Although a plant like wiregrass grows faster if it has more nutrients, it doesn't get a chance to, because it gets overtopped by species that are better adapted to taking advantage of those nutrients. So keeping the site low in fertility is important in restoration. And in my site, they had spread sewage effluent when they were managing the pastures, and so the phosphorus levels are high. I'm trying to get rid of both by doing hot growing season burns and keeping nitrogen fixers from fixing nitrogen, at least these exotic ones. But getting rid of the phosphorus is really taking a long time. And it's funny or ironic, that farmers and people growing, God forbid, lawns want to retain the phosphorus and increase the nitrogen. And I'm trying to do the opposite, but live and learn. Well, when I came, as I said, there wasn't much around, ragweeds and so forth, but there's an elephantopus there in the mid ground, and it's a native. It's a nice one. I like it. I'm actually experimenting with it now, trying to make elephantopus pavement to keep out other things, but kind of fun, these rosette species. And I thought, well, God, maybe my mistake was that I should have started with a clean slate. Instead of messing around and trying to save a pawpaw here and an elephantopus there, I should have just plowed, herbicided, just gotten down to a bare slate. Well, that's a mistake, because there are no bare slates, or a bare slate is really hard to create. I already mentioned that hairy indigo has buried dormant seeds. This species, beautiful as it is and fun, Phytolacca americana, the pokeweed, we've all played with. Its seeds, according in Michigan anyway, are known to last in the soil for more than a century. And how many seeds does one pokeweed plant produce? It's in the thousands in a single season. So these seeds are down there in the soil. And to think that you can go to a bare slate by just killing whatever's leafy is a mistake. And they're going to keep coming. And so are the ragweeds, so are the dog fennels, and other species of rudderals, these disturbance adapted species with buried dormant seeds. And we've done studies in intact pine savannas out at the Ordway-Swisher Reserve, and we didn't find much in the seed bank, it's called, the buried dormant seeds, that you want. There were native species there, but they were mostly like pussy toes and things that are very common, and not the desirables that we have in our goals of big flowered and bunch grasses and so forth. We didn't find any of them in the seed bank. The other bare slate problem is this one, Bahia, which is a great Argentinian, southern Brazil origin forage grass that's really hard to kill. And centipede grass is even worse. One little fragment of the stolon, and within a year, you're back to centipede cover. And Bahia grass is the same way. So it's adapted to fire. Fire knocks it back, but it survives most fires. And it's hard as heck to get rid of. I had a student who worked on that very question back in the 90s. And one of the members of his committee was from the agronomy department, and he was getting ready to retire. And he really enjoyed being on the committee because he had spent his whole career trying to grow Bahia grass. And the last committee on which he was going to sit as a faculty member at University of Florida was dedicated to killing Bahia grass. So it's possible, but it takes years of repeated application of herbicides. Small clumps can be dealt with manually, but wow, it's a tough one. Again, clean slates aren't very clean. So part of my problem is maybe not seen as a problem, is that I grew up, I guess I'm part of the Silent Spring generation. And I don't like to use pesticides. And the fact that these pesticides are all readily available and, without a permit, without any regulations, is terrifying. But in my site, one of the problems that I have is because of fire suppression, there was heavy duty hardwood invasion. Hardwoods are part of pine savannas, but only thick bark oaks and some species of hickory, not these thin bark oaks like water oak and laurel oak. So I knew, and I've called these areas with longleaf pines in the overstory and water oaks and sweet gums and so forth in the understory, I've called them junk hammock, because a hammock is a broadleaf forest vegetation and a legitimate vegetation and wonderful where they develop naturally and can have 25 species of canopy trees. But if you suppress fire in pine savannas, usually you get invasion of these hardwoods. So I wanted to get rid of these hardwoods to provide room for blazing stars and deer tongue and wiregrass and so forth. But I didn't want to use herbicides, so I cut them. And sometimes I cut them low to the ground. And then I did not apply arboricide to the stump, and they sprouted back. And whereas when I started, I had a single trunk that was easy to cut. 5 years later or 3 years later, I had a swarm of sapling size, pole size trees that were really difficult to cut. So what I do now is I cut them and then I apply herbicide just to the vascular cambium to keep them from sprouting. It's not 100% effective. I don't use very much herbicide, but it keeps me from having these shrubs develop that are almost worse than the trees that replace them. But I've tried other things. I've tried girdling, and girdling works. I mean, they can sprout from below the girdle if you don't apply herbicide, but I like the idea of snags. I like the idea of having dead standing trees for woodpeckers, for hole nesting animals and so forth. But I did this in a place where we have trails near the house, where the kids played and so forth. And a junk hammock of dead trees is a pretty darn dangerous place until those trees fall down, because they have big branches that can fall and so forth. So having dead snags around thoroughfares, walking trails and so forth, wasn't a very good idea. And these are fire maintained ecosystems that I'm talking about. So the natural fire return interval is 2 to 3 years in these upland sites anyway. And I'm trying to get that fire regime back with summer fires. And anyone who uses fire, who deals with fire, is going to have stories to tell about fires that got away despite the best planning. My fire story that I'm going to tell you, one of these mistakes related to the dead standing trees, these snags that have the propensity to catch on fire, and some reason they have a propensity to catch on fire high up. So cutting a tree is dangerous. Cutting a dead tree is particularly dangerous because the branches can fall. If it's hollow, you think that there's holding wood, so it may not fall in the direction you want. But cutting a dead tree that's on fire is insane. There you are with a chainsaw, a gas-powered chainsaw with burning embers coming down on top of you. No, it's really just awful. But one of my mistakes was to leave a snag near one of my fire breaks. So I had a unit that I was burning, and then adjacent to it was an area that I didn't want to burn. But the snag that I didn't notice was smoldering, and then it fell across the fire break and ignited the other side, and I ended up burning a couple acres that I hadn't intended to burn. It wasn't an unmitigated disaster, but it was definitely a mistake. So dealing with these snags turned out to be something that I take pretty seriously now, especially when there's fire around. Well, while I'm on the topic of fire, a mistake that I was making, and I should say it wasn't just me, it was a lot of people who were doing landscape management. We burned in the winter. In the winter, we have fronts that are predictable, wind directions are predictable. It's cooler, it's more comfortable to do the burns, and it's easier to get volunteers to help you, and pleasant way to spend an afternoon in the winter. Only thing is that that's not historical or natural fire season, and winter fires are not as effective as growing season fires in doing what you want them to do, which is to control hardwoods. One of the things you want them to do. So top killing the hardwoods, they mostly resprout, but if you burn them repeatedly every year or two or three, you can eventually knock them back and make the world safe for these hundreds of species of herbaceous plants that need savanna, open savanna conditions and get shaded out within just a few years by hardwoods with fire suppression. So I switched, like most fire managers, to growing season fires, and didn't realize initially that you really need to be careful with summer fires when it's hot. And it is hot in the summer. But if the air temperature is already 95 degrees, and then you put a fire under it, you can severely stress even longleaf pine trees, which are very fire resistant. So I've killed by crown scorch trees that I didn't want to kill because I was burning when the air was still, the heat concentrated, rose up, and just hurt browned the needles of the pines, and they just couldn't put up with that kind of stress. So now I want a little bit of breeze to stirring the air and moving that heat away, and I don't like to let fires sit under trees for very long. So I'm learning about fire, but making mistakes. As I said, I just want to make new mistakes. So I've done a lot of crown scorching, and sometimes you have more trees than probably should be there or would be there naturally, but it is after you've planted and tended a tree for a decade or two or three, it's sometimes pretty hard to give them up, especially when you do it by mistake. The other mistake was not understanding that when you reintroduce fire to areas that have gone without fire for a long time, let's say a decade or two, around the bases of longleaf pines, especially big longleaf pines, there accumulates a layer of organic matter that's called duff, or it's organic or more humus, but it's mostly bark and can be a little bit of a mound around the base of the longleaf pines. And in an area where I had a couple of remnant longleaf pines and reintroduced fire, I didn't this was back in the early 90s, I didn't recognize that these low intensity smoldering combustion happening around the base of the pines was going to kill them. I was reintroducing fire to save these trees, but killed a couple of them with the treatment because of these duff fires. So take several hours to burn around the base of the tree. They heat up the soil and kill roots. The bark is very thick, but you can still do damage to the base of the tree. And so the accumulation of duff and reintroducing fire is a challenge that researchers are still working on how to do it in a cost-effective manner. If you have a small area, you can rake or blow around the bases of the big longleaf pines to keep the smoldering from happening, from the duff fires from happening. But in big areas, it's a challenge. Okay, well, here's a philosophical kind of error, an error into which I plunged, and this has become known as a myth, and a myth has been defined as a cherished belief of someone else. Well, the myth, the Field of Dreams myth, comes from this Kevin Costner movie that many of you saw, where he's a corn farmer in Iowa, and he has this vision that if he creates a ball field, the 1918 Black Sox team will come, and he's just fixated on the memory or the history of this famous baseball team. So he builds this cornfield, and of course, it works. They come out of the corn, and the repeated message that he gets in his dreams is, if you build it, he will come. And that was a particular player that he was interested in having visit his baseball field in a baseball diamond in a cornfield. Well, in my case, the build it and it will come myth is manifest in I have areas where I have built this longleaf pine ecosystem. If you stand back and look at it, it looks like a longleaf pine ecosystem. It has scattered pine trees, and in between the scattered pine trees, there's a lot of light and there's a lot of herbaceous growth. There's grasses and there are flowering forbs and so forth. And I have the fire regime right. I'm burning in the growing season every year or two, 3. But my mistake was thinking that since I have everything right, the species will appear. The species that I want will appear. Well, many of you are gardeners or vegetable gardeners. And when you plant a vegetable garden, you till the soil, you put in compost, you get everything ready. And then you just don't stand back and wait for the tomatoes to appear. You plant them. Well, maybe tomatoes is a bad example because I keep getting tomatoes germinating in my compost pile. But okay, you plant the seeds because just because you made conditions perfect for your garden plants, you're not going to get them. Well, somehow in restoration, we keep thinking that these species are going to appear. And many of them are very poorly dispersed, that they don't regenerate from seed very often. And because I don't have an intact pine savanna right nearby, there's no place for these seeds or propudulas to come from. So I end up bringing them in. And often that doesn't work either, because I'm not sure why. So when I collect seed, let's say I collect blazing star seed, and you go along and maybe you've done it, you go and you strip off some seed, you leave enough for regeneration, and if there are exotics around, you control them, you make the world better for blazing stars in your collection sites, and you get permission to do that, of course. And then you go and you plant them. Well, okay, in a restoration setting, Initially, I just tossed them around. Well, I learned more. And then I recognized that if a small seed falls on top of leaf litter, it's not going to germinate. If it germinates, it's not going to survive. So I provide a mineral soil surface on which the seeds can land. And okay, to make sure there's good contact between the seed and the soil, then I'll roll or just stomp on the seeds. Often what I'm doing is I'm in an area, I find a clump of bahia grass, I'll carefully pull it up, get it all, have some seeds in my pocket, spread some seeds out, tamp them down, so I've made a good place for them. And I believe in seed more than is justified. And I keep believing in seed. And every year I plant thousands and thousands of seed. Although my success rate is down there around 1 in 1,000. Well, actually, turns out that's not so bad. Because if you think about it, you have a blazing star plant. Let's say it lives 10 years. And each year it produces, say, 1,000 seeds. They produce many more than that. So that's 10,000 seeds. In the lifetime of a blazing star plant, individual, how many babies is it going to have that survive to adulthood? Well, the answer is, on average, 1. Because if a large proportion of the blazing star seeds survived and grew up to reproductive maturity, pretty soon planet Earth would be expanding out into the universe at the speed of sound due to proliferation of blazing stars. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but no, it isn't, probably not. But in any case, there's the likelihood of a seed making it is very, very small in nature. And it's very, very small in my restoration sites. And there's some species from which I have yet to see a seedling, like the asimines. I don't find seedlings. When I think I see a small asimina, a pawpaw, any of 5 species that I have, I'll dig around the base, and sure enough, it's connected to a big taproot. So I'd love to see a seedling. I do spread pawpaw seeds with the hopes that that's going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. But so belief in seed, I won't say that that's a myth, but it's tough. A mistake that was easy. I had a mimosa. This is Albizia julibrisum. It's an invasive exotic. It's pretty though, and I left one. Big mistake. 20 years later, I'm still finding little babies of mimosa popping up. It has seed dormancy and it makes a lot of seed, and yeah, leaving one was a mistake. And what about partridge pea? It's a native species and the pollinators really like it. And I'm not sure what to do about it, because I have areas that are 100% partridge pea. Right now, this season, I look out, I see just yellow flowers. I know that under them is a couple dozen other species that are struggling to make it in the shade of the partridge peas. This is a native species, but it's common. Should I leave it alone and let it set seed and then next year have the same problem? Should I, if you cut them or mow them, they don't seem to resprout very abundantly. It's an annual. Okay, here's an easier one. Here's ragweed. It's the quintessential rudderell species. And I have a lot of ragweed this time of year. And it's a native species. It has very dormant seeds. It's the cause of hay fever, so I could yank it out in defense of people who suffer from that from the pollen. But wow, if you pull them up, you disturb the soil and you make the world safe for ragweed to germinate again, or partridge pea, or hairy indigo, or any of these other rudderell species. So I'm not sure that I'm making a mistake, but I am, as I wander through my restoration gardening and I see a desirable native species that's being crowded by ragweeds, I do pull them. But, some people have said about this species and about dog fennel, well, just be patient, young man. Just, they'll go away. Well, I know I have places on our land where it's been 18 years since dog fennel appeared and it's still going strong. So I don't know how patient you need to be. But if you have large areas, then you can't do very much. So
at Flamingo Hammock, where I live, when people ask me how I'll know when the ecosystems here are fully restored, I'll probably say, I don't think we'll ever get there, but I would use fox squirrels as an indicator species that we're doing really well. And fox squirrels, I hope you've seen them, it's a big, beautiful animal, 2 or 3 times larger than one of those gray brush-tailed tree rats that are so common on campus and so forth. The fox squirrel is a big animal. It's a savanna animal. They don't survive in forests. They eat along with pine cones and acorns. And when frightened, they often jump to the ground and run across the ground. And so dogs are a big problem with fox squirrels. I have an essay about fox squirrels in Dandyland's book that I encourage you to read. It's kind of fun, but every fox squirrel is a different color pattern.
I'm going to stop with my slides there. Fox squirrels are my indicator species of success in restoration. And I'll encourage you, Valerie asked me to remind you that if you have questions, you can type them into chat box and then she'll relate them to me. I do hope you have some questions. And maybe you have some mistakes you could share.
So what we have, Dr. Putz, it's actually a pretty good discussion going in the chat. One question, are there fox squirrels in Flamingo Hammock?
There have been. They've appeared and then disappeared. We have now getting close to the requisite 40 acres of open savanna. So I think we're ready for fox squirrels now, and maybe there's a reintroduction program we could take advantage of. We benefited in our restoration efforts from the biomass plant, where we could, getting rid of the invasive hardwoods was the first step towards restoration, and with a market for wood chips, we could afford to treat bigger areas. We actually kept the lights of Gainesville on for 6 hours with hardwood chips. So that's helping make the world safe for fox squirrels. I thought pretty a little odd to be using fox squirrels as an indicator, an animal to be an indicator of success in pine savanna restoration for a presentation of the Native Plant Society, but fox squirrels are pretty special.
I think it's perfectly acceptable.
Okay.
Lisa Ryan asks if you could please share your contact information again.
Oh, yeah. I'm easy to find. I am FEP, my initials for Francis Edward Putz, at ufl.edu. So maybe Val can include that somewhere.
Yes, I just dropped that in the chat.
Okay.
Okay, and would you like to proceed with the discussion from the beginning of your talk to now, or go in reverse?
Either way.
Either way. Okay, well, let's start. Michael Adler has been I know him, and he's been quite a robust participant in the discussion. He says, I would like to visit your restoration area and invite you to see mine, which is right next to Flamingo Hammock.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, we could compare notes.
Yes. All right, I'll send you guys an intro email after this.
Great.
Okay. You have a compliment. Donna Day says, make no mistake about it, your presentation was fabulous and worth repeating. Thank you
Nice
so
to
much
hear.
for sharing your learning with us in such an engaging manner.
Oh, thank you.
Dusty has said that she's also, well, I guess this could be a man as well. They have taken to pulling ragweed, sandspurs, and chamber bitter as of late. Fortunately, they're only at the periphery.
Yeah, the sandspurs I go after with a passion, or with a shovel anyway. Try to get them before they sprout. Um, the dog knows where they are, and she won't go anywhere near them, even though she's a fanatical retriever. You throw the ball anywhere near sandspurs or prickly pear, and she just looks at you like, oh. She's the same way about Jake the snake. We have a pretty big diamondback rattler, and she knows where Jake is. Actually, I think Jake's a female because she had babies one year. She won't go anywhere near that either, but pretty smart dog in her own way. Yeah, but pulling them is, I mean, if you have a huge area, then that's obviously impossible. But for our areas, and that I'm going all the time, every morning I'm walking there, I don't mind spending half an hour weeding. And if you don't, then you build the buried seed bank. And the other thing about restoration for me is that it can happen at any scale. I have the privilege of working at a pretty large scale, but I think in a couple square feet you can do some restoration. Replacing turf grass with bunch grass, native bunch grasses, is restoration. And you think it's kind of odd to call that restoration, but when I first started, we had this gigantic area of junk hammock, and I went in and cleared an area and burned the trees, and there were some remnant grasses in the understory. And damn, if a year later a gopher tortoise didn't move in. They're moving a lot, looking for places to colonize where there's food, and they eat herbaceous vegetation. So even small areas of restoration can be quite effective. And my goal is I want to get up to around 100 species, because in at least in this one area of pine savanna that I've been focused on, because that from Susan Carr and other people who have sampled lots of pine savannas, 80 to 100 species would be about normal for an area that size. I mean, there are many more that could be there, and I'd be happy with that. But I'm about 40% of the way there. I have about 40 species. I'm trying to get to 100. I've been at it for 30 years. So I did some projections of the rate of species reintroduction, successful reintroduction. And if I continue on this trajectory until I'm 113 years old, I will get to the goal. You can't have any lapses between now and when I'm 113 years old. I better not miss any years, because then the rudderals will come and so forth. And I thought, oh my God, that's terrible. But then a paper just came out, and I cited it in that essay that Valerie made available to you, I think. Just came out in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. One of the authors is a former student who did his PhD here at the University of Florida, Joe Veldman. And they looked at natural regeneration or natural reconstitution of grassland plant communities, global. And they projected how long it would take for these grasslands to get back their, what they call old growth characteristics. So getting back all these species that are characteristic of this ecosystem. And their estimate that on average, it takes 1,400 years. So the fact that it's going to take me 60 years to get this back with active restoration is pretty darn good compared to 1,400 years without any intervention. And I actually think their estimate it's an underestimate, because some of these species would never come back because they're just too far from any source of propagules without some assistance. So I've tried to do plant rescue as well in areas where I know they're going to go in and bulldoze. If I know in advance, then going and just taking blocks of sod or topsoil from good habitat is a good thing to do too, but the developers often don't let you know what they're going to tear up. And sometimes they don't even recognize it. Plant blindness is a pretty serious problem. So 60 years versus 1,400 years, I'm doing pretty well.
Yeah, yeah. Let's do a little plug for FNPS plant rescues. We do a lot of rescues in like Claremont and Orlando area, but we're going to help out Pinellas chapter with a rescue down there. So if your chapter doesn't currently do rescues, we'd like to help you get started. If you have a volunteer corps, if you know of places that are getting developed, we have experience with, getting the right permits if there are rare plants on the property, listed plants on the property, and also helping with, our insurance, so that our insurance will cover the rescues, and dealing with landowner contact and getting permission. So yeah, feel free to contact me. I'll drop my email address in the chat if you would like to get rescue started in your chapter. Let's see. You got a long-lived Jack Putz. Okay. Lisa Ryan has a kind of a complicated question, but do we have any list of endemic species that homeowners can consider attempting to plant?
In the paper that I also cited in my little essay by Susan Carr, that's one of the best places I've seen to get an easy list of species. She doesn't differentiate them as endemic, but a lot of them are endemic. But no, I'm not sure. That's something we could look into, though, couldn't we?
Yeah, so I mean, we do have our plant finder on the FNPS website, and that does indicate endemism, but I don't think you can sort by endemism. So I would just go in there and or you could tell me which county you're in, and I can eyeball the endemics. Lisa, just type in here your county, and I'll run the thing for you, and I'll send you a list of endemics that might be available in the nursery trade. Yeah, of course. An advanced search in the plant atlas can give you the list, but it's not going to tell you what's available in the nursery trade. So that's USF Plant Atlas. I can drop a link in the chat. Okay, another question. Karen Garin, which is a great name, asks, back to Bahia. Besides herbicide, are there any other methods to get rid of it?
No, as I said, that in an area that I have treated in various ways, I end up now going in, if I have some clumps of Bahia, especially after a fire, like a month after a fire when things are still just greening up, I'll go in with a shovel and remove them. But for big areas, it's hard to do that. So yeah, some combination. Fire seems to reduce the size of the clumps. It's a stoloniferous thing, and it knocks it back, makes it a little easier to dig and easier to see. They green up pretty fast after a fire, so then they're not so hard to dig either. But yeah, those are the only alternatives I know, and the digging doesn't scale up to very large areas easily.
Yeah, Michael Adler chimes in after that. He's a big fan of the Nigiri Gamma hoe, but you have to sharpen it yourself, which maybe could be complicated. He says he's cleared a lot of area of occasional Bahia grass with it, avoiding desirable species. Yeah,
that's what you want. That's the problem with herbicides, that they're non-selective. I mean, they're herbicides that just hit grasses, but then you have native bunch grasses, and I mean, the whole herbicide story is a difficult one, because it's hard to imagine doing restoration at scale without herbicides. But I maintain that kind of hesitation about using them too much, because they are toxic. And maybe they don't have long soil half-lives and so forth. It's not very comforting to me that most of the research on their safety is paid for by the companies that make the chemicals, but because that's the way it is. But I'm just always very careful. And stump treatment, a liter of herbicide mixed up will last me weeks and weeks of using some every day, because I'm only using drops, not vast quantity. But again, I'm doing restoration at almost a boutique level, not at huge industrial scale.
Okay, so Bonnie Basham, who's our president, asks, when we had fox squirrels, we also had pileated woodpeckers. Is that common? And so she's up in the Panhandle near Tallahassee.
Yeah, well, we have pileated woodpeckers. They're those snags they really like. Maybe the fox squirrels will come behind them. I mean, they're both pretty good indicators of enough habitat, but pileated seem a little bit more flexible in the kinds of vegetation in which they'll flourish, and a huge range as well. The fox squirrels are just such lovely beasts as well. I mean, I like pileated, but no, I'm not sure of any association between them, but nice to think about.
I'm not sure that you have any knowledge on this, but Bonnie says that there's that USDA is pushing back on their desire to reforest their property with longleaf pines. She wants to know how to overcome that, so I'm not aware of that issue.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but it was interesting. A decade or two ago, there was a push to get people to plant longleaf pine, and that seems like a good thing, but a lot of the time what we got was longleaf pine plantations. And, you know, they're not much better than off-site slash pine plantations. But it has partly been educating the tax assessors that they were looking for 600 trees per acre or something, and that would be killer. You couldn't have a pine savanna with that many trees. So getting them to recognize a functioning ecosystem and then providing the tax benefits of doing restoration, that's a never-ending battle, because tax assessors change and they need to get brought up to speed. And some of them have been really quite helpful in this regard with habitat restoration.
Yeah, the tax assessors are difficult also with beekeepers, you know, encouraging, not knowing how many bees you need to have on your property and what's a sustainable number of bees. And yeah, interesting. Okay, Karen Guerin has another question. Are you going to have a restoration tour this fall? Because she's looking for restoration examples for COVID-19 safe field trips for her F&PS chapter.
I'll have to ask Richard Heyman. Yeah, odd times in which we're living, but thanks for the prompt on that, Karen.
No questions. Bonnie would like to know, what's the average number of longleaf pines per acre so I can tell her property appraiser?
Well, you know, the interesting thing about longleaf pine ecosystems is that they varied way more than I originally thought. I mean, I had the privilege of visiting the Wade Track in southern Georgia. It's run by Tall Timbers Research Station. And for a long time, that was my reference state. And there, I suspect they have like 60 to 80 large longleaf pines per acre, if that. But when you look at historical photographs, you see everything from very sparse savanna with the trees separated by 50, 60 feet. And then you see pictures of longleaf pine forest, I mean, with trees next to each other. And longleaf pine is a pretty miraculous species as well, because it grows in high, dry, xeric sandhills. But there were also longleaf pine flatwoods. And a lot of the places that are dominated now by slash pine used to be dominated by longleaf pine. But they changed the fire regime, and timber companies preferred slash pine to longleaf, and so they got shifted over. But so longleaf went from growing in places that were shallowly inundated for a couple months a year to growing in high, dry places. So there's no one answer to that question, but In most uplands on severely drained sites, I think you'd be down in the 50 to 100 trees, and that would be about right. But it depends on the reference state that you're using and your goals as a manager. If you're really into lots of wildflowers and bunch grasses, then you're going to have fewer canopy trees. One thing about pine ecosystems is that often you need enough pine straw to carry the fire, and pine needles are great fuel. And so I said before, I was not quite telling the truth. When you look at my restored pine savanna, you see it structurally in good shape, but wait, that's not longleaf pine. That's loblolly pine. Oh yeah, okay. And wait, what's that one? And it turns out that about half of my longleaf pines are hybrids between longleaf pine and loblolly pine, naturally occurring hybrids, the San Driago pine, it's called. And actually in the industry, they know about it because they don't want to get it mixed into their nurseries. But I had pines that had cones that were halfway between longleaf and slash pine, needles that were halfway, branches that were halfway, and that was before I learned about this natural hybrid. But now I know I have a lot of natural hybrids. So when I said it looks like a longleaf pine savanna, well, not if you're really good at identifying pines. You'd realize that I was fudging a little bit. But part of the reason for that is that I want the needle cast so that I can do controlled burns when otherwise, if I didn't have it, the fires would be very patchy and not hot enough. So that I've gotten more tolerant of loblolly, and I'm actually secretly thrilled with these hybrids. And some of them were tapped for turpentine, for resin. So even the hybrids were tapped, not just the longleaf. Loblolly was never tapped. It wouldn't put up with it, I don't think. Around here anyway.
So I just want everybody to know that it's 102, and these lectures are DVR'd. So if you're still willing to keep going, Jack.
Sure.
Okay, he's good. So we'll keep going on the discussion. If you need to go, this will be right here. If you want to watch the rest of it, if you need to go, if you only budgeted an hour. But we've got a killer question. Why is fire during the growing season important?
So think about a laurel oak that's 3 feet tall. It's connected to a network of roots and rhizomes and taproots and so forth. During the growing season, it's growing. And then at the end of the growing season, in September, October, it starts provisioning carbohydrates below ground, storing them below ground. And so if you burn in the winter, the tree has prepared itself for resprouting by increasing these stored carbohydrates below ground. So they resprout much more effectively. That's part of the reason. So if you burn in the winter, the plant resprouts more readily. Instead, if you burn right in say June, then the plant has taken those stored carbohydrates and put them all into growth. And if you knock it then, you stress the plant more. So that would be the advantage. Another advantage is that fires in the growing season are hotter because the air temperatures are higher. But killing resprouting hardwood is really difficult. I mean, you top kill them, but you're trying to exhaust them, and it takes a long time to get rid of them. And in fact, with laurel oaks, which is one of the main species of hardwoods that I have in my restored pine savannas, I always walk around with a long-handled spade, and I find it very gratifying to pull out laurel oaks. So the laurel oak might only be this tall, but when I get a shovel on it, it has a root that's this thick and goes down, 2-3 feet. But when they pop out, it feels like in a day when I may not accomplish very much as a scientist or writer or teacher or anything else, I'll at least have pulled up 10 laurel oaks that would otherwise have clogged my pine savanna restoration. So a feeling of accomplishment. Sometimes they break. And they're often connected. So you get one and then you end up getting three. It's that. The other species I have trouble with is muscadine grape, Vitis rotundifolia. And it's remarkable. I mean, I was doing that for until it got old this morning. And you have grapevine tangles, and you think if you killed all the stuff on the top, you'd be done, but there's also a tangle below ground. And they have roots and fallen stems, but they also make these rhizomes that are really remarkable, that can go many, many meters, and they don't branch or anything, and they're succulent and probably full of stored carbohydrates. And so getting rid of a vine tangle is a big job. So to clear a vine tangle the size of my office here would be a good morning's work with a shovel, but a lot of back exercise as well. So there you go.
And we're here in the discussion about burning, but Michael Adler did drop a question in. Any advice about seeds on sloping land? I've had problems with them all washing away in a rainstorm and erosion on very mild slopes, and longleaf pine forests occur with much more slope than I've worked with.
Yeah. My experience with slopes is limited. I did learn about the exponential rate of fire spread up slopes. That was pretty exciting. No harm was done, but it was shocking. But on slopes, even on flat ground or relatively flat ground, I'll see seeds being shifted around. I've started being more careful about making sure I have good contact between the seeds and the mineral soil. And so even an indentation might keep them from flowing downhill. But no, that's a problem. And you put out so many seed, and washing away is one problem. I think that seed predation by ants, I love harvester ants, but they eat a lot of seed, and towhees and other birds, I suppose, but I'm just not sure why so few of these seeds actually make it. Like sandhill milkweed, the big one with the white leaves, pinkish leaves, lovely thing. Humus strata, I think, is the species, Asclepius. And it flowers early and fruits in the summer, and I'll plant a couple hundred seeds a year. And they're big seeds, and I plant them after pulling something out. So I know I have good seed soil contact. I know there's no competition because I just pulled out the competitor. And I do see them, but not many. Maybe again, 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 500. And that's a big seeded thing. And, I should also do it in my garden where I have more control and I'm watering the vegetables and so forth, just to see what the impediments are. But then a neighbor who grows these things in pots to grow them up and then outplant them said that she had some seed that didn't germinate for a year, and they came up in the second year. So maybe these seeds will just sit around for a while. But I'm surprised at that. I'm not exactly sure. I continue to plant seed, but do so even more carefully. And the seed washing issue is, toughy. Maybe some brush, like little dams, at least they'd collect and not go all the way down.
Eugene comments that most prescriptions for burning in long suppressed areas with lots of duff accumulation, back to your, killing a pine tree slide, is to ensure a certain level of soil/duff moisture to prevent it from smoldering for hours. And he says if it took decades to accumulate, you don't even want to try burning it all off in one go.
Yeah, no, burning it off is really pretty much a disaster. Morgan Varner, who's now back, I mean, he did his PhD here on Duff. Actually started in a tree behind our house. Well, I went out one night. My wife, sensitive to smoke, you know, being married to a fire ecologist, it's a little bit disturbing. And we sleep outdoors. We have a screen porch where we sleep. And she was complaining to me in the middle of the night about my fire, and it was still smoking, but I had put it all out. It had been all out. And so I went out in my slippers. It must have been in one of those winter fires because I had slippers. And I went out in my slippers to find where this fire was. This is like 92 or so. And I was standing out there. I turn out the light. It's pitch black. I can't see any smoldering. I can't see any red, nowhere. And I was standing there going, my God, oh, my feet are getting hot. And it was burning under the surface of the duff. The duff has 3 levels to it. And right next to the mineral soil is the finely ground stuff that's driest and easiest to catch on fire. And it had burned in and under, and I was standing on a duff fire. And it was smoldering and going very slowly. So yeah, the duff is problematic. And Morgan just told me he's following up on moisture contents. And what he's finding, I have to ask him about this, but he said that the moisture content really varies a tremendous amount as you go from the base of the tree and out. That there's some places where if you just did one measure of moisture content of the duff, you might just get it entirely wrong for other places. And so it's hard. And what we've tried doing in bigger areas is with a blower, a real strong blower that we're using for fire breaks as well, blowing off the surface litter around the base of the pines. Because what happens when you don't do that is the fire goes by, burns the litter, but maybe there's a pine cone or a piece of fat wood and it catches on fire, smoldering, you know, and then cooks its way, burns its way down to the mineral soil, drying out the duff on the way down. And then you have a dry surface of duff, and it burns in this way. It burns closest to the ground first, and it dries it above, and it just moves like that. So even when the duff is moist in some places, you can catch it on fire. But at least if you've blown off the litter, that ignition source isn't there. Of course, you know, you can get embers and so forth coming in. So it's tricky. You know, some people don't have the luxury of having big old longleaf pines, and I'm willing to work hard to save them. But burning these smaller areas, you know, in suburban neighborhoods sounds crazy, but we did a project with Kim Huberger years ago. It was her master's thesis, a beautiful project out at Hale Plantation, which is an upscale golfing community on the west side of Gainesville. They destroyed all this pine savanna to put in this community and a golf course. Get environmental awards for that somehow. But in any case, we convinced the golf club managers to let us burn in the rough of the fairways. And we were burning right up to those fairway homes that, you know, these expensive houses right on the fairways of the golf course. People want to live. And they had swimming pools with fences and so forth. And we did, I can't remember, 30 of these burns. They were small, and the areas have been fire suppressed. It was longleaf pine, turkey oak. There were still some remnant understory species around, and Kim's measure of response was pretty flowers. I mean, we had a list of showy flowers, and so it was a combination of an alternative to mechanical and chemical treatments, a way of making this prettier landscape. And we did some, she did a lot of environmental education and signage, and people were very happy to have us burning. They came out and helped us. They stood there with their rakes and their garden hoses and stuff as we burned up to their fences and so forth. it was very effective at controlling the hardwoods that they would normally have mowed and sprayed. And I went to the 19th hole, which I'm not a golfer, so I didn't know what that was. That's the bar. And so I went to the bar and was talking to the golfers after this, and they said, well, we really liked this. It helped our game. Huh? How does burning in the rough help your game? Finally, somebody explained. In golf, if you lose your ball, you lose points. So a white golf ball really is easy to find against the black stubble of a controlled burn. And so they got fewer. You don't want to get a lot of points in golf. And so they liked it a lot. And to my frustration and embarrassment, they went back to mechanical treatments and herbicide treatments. So and we did an EDIS publication for IFAS. We published it in a good journal. There were newspaper stories. Kim did it all right. But then I went back to Bolivia to do my tropical forest conservation work. And she got a job down in Sarasota County. And we didn't do this promotion follow-up. And I always wonder, as a scientist, where my duty ends. I thought we did everything right, but we didn't do enough to change the behavior. So they went back to the old way. And so it was successful scientifically, but it wasn't successful in changing behaviors. And that's what my work is on now, is trying to figure out how to change those behaviors and learning a lot more about behavioral economics and behavioral sciences in general. And I think go back to the turf grass question of how do you convince somebody that a chem lawn is not a good idea, and that dumping fertilizers on a lawn is an environmental disaster, because there's a whole mindset around that, and there's peer pressure and there's all this stuff. So I'm trying to learn enough from advertisers, from political campaigns, of how do you get people to change their behavior, and it's not easy. But that using fire in a suburban landscape, I think, is very feasible in small scales and could have some advantages. Of course, there's surrogate treatments. You can mimic the effects of fire with cutting and mulching and so forth. But I think the fire is an attraction for a lot of people as well. There's fear associated with it, but I teach, undergraduate and graduate courses, and in all my courses before this COVID disaster, we did control burns, and everyone in the class had to do an independent research project on a fire. And I've been doing this for 30 plus years, and I don't remember names very well, but I remember faces. And so we'll be in a restaurant or something and walk in, I'll recognize somebody, and I'll just ask them, a question about botany or plant ecology. Do you know the difference between xylem and phloem? And they'll look at me like, oh my God, who is this insane guy? Xylem? Wait, that was my teacher. Oh no, I have no idea the difference between xylem and phloem, but I remember the fire. It was just like something stuck. And I'm not sure how many pyromaniacs I've inspired, but I think of getting everyone exposed to fire as an undergraduate is, it should be a prerequisite for graduation from the University of Florida, but I think we have a long ways to go before the administration accepts that. And it's also, you can do it on a very small scale. The kinds of fires we use for our students, we'll do a big fire so they can see what it's like, but then when they're doing their experiments, they're often, small, dinner table size, rather than massive, and they still work. They accomplish ecologically what you want to accomplish, and from a scientific perspective, they work perfectly well.
Yeah, Karen Guerin is very interested in this because she asked a question earlier about urban burns. So she's interested in Green Tree Park in Gainesville. Yeah. She thinks it would make a great research site for urban burns.
Yeah, the remnant vegetation there is fantastic. There's species there that I would love to have. we need to get the city more energetic in their fires. And, you know, it's hard with government employees. Sometimes they tend to be more risk averse than perhaps they need to be, but it varies a lot. I remember years ago, the water management district, St. John's Water Management District, was doing really, really well with its land management. They had burned 110% of what they said they should burn in their management plans for the year. In a year where the state parks burned 40%, and it was because of personality of who was running the show. And do you find a reason to not burn, or do you find a reason to burn? And so in some institutions, if you burn, you have to have really good reasons to burn. In back then in the St. John's Water Management District, if you didn't burn, you had to have a good reason for that. So because they knew that was very much a part of what they needed to do for the biota, but also for water. And recent findings are showing that hydrological findings that aquifer recharge is really benefits from stand thinning. So if you have a very dense plantation and you thin it, you get more water in the aquifer. I mean, it just makes sense. And so these pine savannas, upland pine savannas, are the big recharge areas. And in a state where the aquifer is being lowered by over pumping, anything we can do to encourage aquifer recharge should be encouraged. That another benefit. Good.